Welcome back to this episode of The Self-Led Leader. Last week, we talked about how your biggest performance driver is the thing about you that you actually haven't been taught to consider, and that is your self-concept. And in this episode, we are going to cover what your self-concept is, where it comes from, and how you can begin to optimize yours so you can finally start to see progress on all those things that have felt like perpetual roadblocks so far. Let's get right into it. This is The Self-Led Leader. I'm Dr. Christina Adey, and in this show, we explore how your beliefs about who you are and what you're capable of determine the results that you're getting. Every week, we go beyond your skills and strategy to explore the psychology of how you operate and how it's been limiting you so you can finally achieve the goals you didn't think you could. Let's get into today's episode. So it's no surprise that most of us are aiming to optimize our performance in practically every area of our life. Now, I talked about this last week, but so many of us tend to view our lives as having different categories or different boxes. How my health is, how my wealth is, how my relationships are, how my work is. We've heard this, we know this, but what most of us don't realize is that within each of those major boxes, we tend to have subcompartments as well. So we look at things like our motivation, productivity, consistency, our confidence levels, our ability to articulate our thoughts, to show up with confidence and authority versus to hold ourselves back. Our people skills, our social skills, our lead generation, or how productive our teams are and if they're hitting their KPIs. All of these little subcategories that feel so incredibly separate. And let me know if this is you, if you get overwhelmed just thinking about this thing and that thing and this thing over there and perpetually feeling like there's something to do, there's something else to work on, and there's something else to optimize. And I know how frustrating this can be because I've been there myself. And so often it feels like you have to have a separate strategy or a separate workflow for each of these subcomponents. So you look at your consistency and wonder what strategy you're missing to be more consistent there. You might look at your productivity and wonder what strategies or skills or new AI agents or whatever else you're missing to increase your productivity in that area. You might then look at your confidence and wonder, how can I improve my people skills? What am I doing wrong? Am I destined to be perpetually shy and not be able to articulate my thoughts in a meeting or in a client session? And it can be incredibly overwhelming. And then you bring all those pieces back to yourself and you look at yourself like a fragmented mirror and say, this thing is broken, this part is broken, this needs to be optimized, this isn't ideal, and on and on and on. And that's a very fragmented approach that makes us question ourselves. And in each of those cracks, there's an opportunity for doubt to creep in. And so if you find yourself overthinking, overanalyzing, flip-flopping between strategies, having the craving for one more course, one more book, one more podcast, one more thing before I feel finally ready to take charge, maybe it's time to throw all that out the window and have a completely new approach. Maybe it's time to be done with the fragmentation, because when we are looking outside in, it is never a sustainable approach towards true behavioral change that will actually lead us towards not only the goals and outcomes we want, but that inner world that we are craving, the inner feeling that comes with accomplishing those goals. But when you are driven by the external goal, it is so easy to forget about what is happening internally within you and just assume that the internal will change when the external does. But that's not always how it works. And in most cases, that's not how our psychology works. And so I know for myself, my whole life, I've been an overachieving, high achiever, all the achieving boxes. And it was always the next goal, the next milestone, the next thing for me. And part of that was, traditional societal goals of getting the degree or getting the job or hitting a certain salary increase. And part of that was always internal as well, in terms of, can I keep pushing myself to that next goal? But there's no space in that approach for your inner world to actually change and shift beyond pushing and hustling and having your vision geared towards that external thing that's motivating you. And so what would happen consistently in my life, and maybe this is the same thing that's happening to you, and maybe the pattern's there in your life and you just haven't noticed it yet, but I would achieve these goals and feel dissatisfied. And I would just aim for the next goal and push myself for the next thing. I remember one time I was around 18 or 19. I was a university student, still new and fresh to the corporate space. And I was able to obtain a really, nice, prestigious summer job for a pharmaceutical company that was, outside the norm of what a typical student summer job looked like. And it was a really interesting experience because I had multiple, coworkers, colleagues, other people in the organization who came up to me and asked me how I was able to obtain this job because they had never seen anyone external get hired. The only summer students who had been hired traditionally were the children or the students of the parents who were employed within the company. And so it was very strange for them to see me as an outsider get the job. They didn't even know how it was possible. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to. But it was an interesting experience to be like, wow, like this is an achievement. And then within a few months to just feel so incredibly bored and think about what's my next thing. And one of the biggest experiences that really shifted my life and my perspective on this, and this is still a journey that I'm going through now and really trying to be more intentional with my goal setting and my inner world. But I had spent 2 years getting my master's and then an additional 5 years getting my PhD while I had 2 babies at home during COVID, after COVID, the whole thing. It was a very incredibly difficult experience. And it's something that I didn't even think I would achieve, even though in the back of my mind, I always wanted to see how far I can get in academia and if I can get a PhD and possibly, teach or get a professorship one day. And it was quite an interesting experience being in the pursuit of my goal, recognizing that it wasn't necessarily something I wanted anymore. I realized pretty early on that academia wasn't going to be the path for me. But I love knowledge and I love learning and I love the research component. And I put in so much time and effort, and preparing for my dissertation was an incredibly stressful experience. I honestly wasn't sure if I would even pass, so to say. When I passed and they told me that, I'm now Dr. 80, and I came home and I just remember feeling so incredibly empty. And for the next 2 to 3 days at least, I felt so incredibly drained and so incredibly empty. And I remember a moment where I just wanted to cry, and I was thinking, like, what was it all for? I had spent all of my 20s in school, thinking about school, working really hard to be able to get into graduate school. I had spent all my 20s essentially in school. And then I had hit my 30s, and I was so adamant that I wanted to finish my degree and to become a doctor before my 30th birthday. And I accomplished that. And I was like, well, now I'm starting my 30s. And what was it all for if I feel so incredibly empty inside, if this goal was so unsatisfactory? What did I do with the last 3 decades of my life, right? And I think this is an experience that so many of us have because we don't recognize that it's not the goal that fulfills us. And I know that sounds so incredibly cliche, but my take on this is that it's not just the goal, it's our interpretation of the goal and our relation to it. Because I think a fear that so many of us high achieving individuals have is that if we slow down, we just won't want it anymore. It won't feel the same. And that often feels scary. And the thought of not working towards something, the thought of coasting by or getting by your life without achieving these big goals because you didn't push yourself hard enough, to many of us, that actually sounds worse than the thought of missing out because we did try and we did push ourselves. And so my perspective on this is that it takes such an incredible shift in your own perspective, in your own understanding of your relationship to your goals. So I don't think it's about stepping back. and enjoying the process. And I don't think it's just about hustling either, but it's about getting very, very clear on why exactly you're achieving or working towards specific goals, what it is that is supposed to bring you or fulfill within you, but then also understanding why those goals specifically. And I think that is the part that not enough people look at. And so let's get into our self-concept. When I was a child, as most parents do, they come up with cute little fun nicknames for their children. My father affectionately called me Professor all the time. And unbeknownst to me at the time, he was planting these seeds, and I'm sure he was doing it intentionally, but in the process, there was this underlying pressure to do well academically. Even as a child in school, when we get our report cards, my dad would make a deal with me that for every single A that I got, he would give me, $10 or $20 or whatever as a way to motivate me to do better in school. And mind you, I had straight A's all the time. So it was just fun to be able to make some money off of it as an additional bonus. But what I didn't realize at the time that I realize now, looking back on it, is how much that really primed me and taught me and ingrained in me to have these external drivers. And now this is important, and we'll come back to this in a moment, but to have these external drivers that were pushing me towards specific goals, right? And I say pushing me towards them because they really were, they felt like a constant pressure, like a constant push behind my back that made me feel like I can't slow down. I'm unable to slow down. What do you mean to slow down, right? How, just conceptually, what does that mean? I think so many of us high achievers really struggle with slowing down, and, sitting on our hands and twiddling our thumbs feels like a complete waste of time. And I get that. And it's something I'm still working on myself. But there was this perpetual, pressure behind me to make something of myself, to do it through the path of academia, to be able to get good grades and get into a profession that was, well established, well paying, etc. It's like the typical cliche parenting story that so many of us experienced. And so when I got to the end of high school, the guidance counselors would come around and talk to all the seniors and just tell us, pick either university, or if you're not that good at academics, pick college. It doesn't matter what you apply to, just apply and go to a program. And at the time, as a 17-year-old, when you're asked to decide your entire life's future, essentially, I was like, I have no idea what I want to do. And what I did is the process of elimination. I eliminated everything that I knew I did not want to do. And I ended up picking psychology because I had always loved psychology. The human behavior fascinated me. And so through the process of elimination, I just ended up with psychology. And so I'm glad that it worked out for me. But looking back on it, I can see how so much of my decision making was driven by my self-concept, my definition of who I am and what I'm capable of, and the boundaries that I had at the time around what felt intimidating and outside of my comfort zone. And this is one a very clear example where it seems almost trivial in a sense, but it literally can alter the course of your life. So in my case, I had not felt comfortable taking science courses. When I was a young, naive 14-year-old, I wasn't really into science. And so I stuck with my comfort zone and what I knew I liked, which is psychology, rather than truly considering other domains that were a little bit more outside of my comfort zone that I possibly could have pursued and possibly could have thrived in. For example, I love writing. I could have easily chosen something like English literature, and who knows where my life would have ended up with that one decision. But it's the fact that my entire life had been driven by this underlying, little pressure of make something of yourself in academia, make sure you do well in academia, coupled with my own limitations around what I liked, what I didn't like, what felt uncomfortable, what felt challenging, what I was willing to challenge myself in, and what I wasn't willing to challenge myself in. And you have the perfect storm that ended up with me self-selecting psychology as the obvious choice, partly because of the passion, but if I'm being honest, mostly because it felt easy. It felt easy to step into that role and to continue it rather than challenging myself with something else. And so the question becomes, how many of the decisions are we making? How many of the decisions are you making on a daily basis that are driven by your interpretation and your definition of what's comfortable for you, the scope and the boundaries of what you're willing to try, and how much comfort versus discomfort you're willing to tolerate? And so it might seem like these trivial moments that we encounter on a daily basis, but in reality, each of these trivial moments is shaping and changing the trajectory of our lives, often without us noticing. And one of the easiest and clearest ways to see this happening is through something that is so incredibly important and meaningful to us. And for most of us, that is our careers, our businesses, our jobs, because it's something we've pursued with our life. Often for many of us, even if it's just a job, it's something that you're spending so much of your time and energy doing for so much of your adult life. But if you are more in a leadership role, responsible for other people, if you're running your own business, if this is something that is you're passionate about, your livelihood depends on, but this is literally your life's purpose for so many of us, then I think it's worth sitting down and questioning and taking the time to consider how much of that, of the outcomes that we're seeing in this domain, in our business, in our career, how much of it is being restricted by ourselves without us noticing. And so let's unpack our self-concept a little bit more. Our self-concept is the driver of so many of our life outcomes and the behaviors that we choose to engage in and the things we honestly choose not to do. When I first started my business and I was considering what it is that I wanted to do and what it is that I wanted to help people with, self-concept was one of the things that was always top of mind for me. And it took me a while to really come around to the idea of making this a core part of my philosophy publicly and sharing it so openly, because I wasn't sure if people would be receptive to this work. But the more that I work with clients one-on-one and the more that I have these conversations, the more that I see that this is something that is so incredibly impactful and honestly so incredibly needed. And I think for me, because I had spent at least a good 5-6 years deep diving into research on self-concept, I had honestly read probably hundreds of articles at this point talking about different bits and pieces here and there, that it feels so obvious. But for many people, this is probably the first time that you're coming across it, especially in a more academic sense that's not just compressed, conversations around identity. Or I know in the spiritual space, if you're spiritual, if you're into manifestation, if you're into personal development, there's so much work and conversations around just change your identity, right? You have to change your identity first and everything else follows. And I agree with that. And I think part of that work is extremely necessary. But I think your self-concept goes beyond your identity. For me, I see your identity as just how you see yourself, who you think you are. But your self-concept specifically is not just about how you see yourself and who you think you are, but it also has that additional actionable component of what it is that you think you can do, what it is that you think you can't do, and where it is that you belong in. So it's this puzzle with these different pieces that really shape the picture of exactly who you are, what your role is, and where you should be in your life in terms of what you should be doing, who you should be surrounding yourself with, and how you should be, acting or carrying yourself, for simplicity. And so your self-concept is core to who you are. Having the definition in place, I think it's really important to talk about how your self-concept is formed and where it really comes from so that you understand why it is what it is. If you think of your self-concept as a puzzle and all the different pieces put together, well, the actual picture on the puzzle was drawn by someone else. It was sketched in by other people. And it's you who then colored in the different bits and pieces and put the final touches onto it. So here's what I mean. Your self-concept is shaped and created all throughout your life. Your self-concept starts to be molded when you're born, throughout childhood. Whatever beliefs your parents had, the people you spend a lot of time around, the people who had influence over your life, the things that they said to you, how they acted around you, how they taught you, either explicitly or implicitly, so directly or indirectly, all of these things mishmashed together like a piece of clay and molded the start of who you are. But then as you go through life and you have different experiences, all of those continue to chip away at the clay, and they either reinforce specific parts or carve out new ones. And so if we were to simplify this and you were to ask, well, Christina, what influences my self-concept? The short answer would be everything. Now, for the long answer, I like to simplify this into three core categories: first-hand experience, second-hand experience, and third-hand experience. So first-hand experience would be the things that you have actually lived through. These are interactions you have had, things that were directly told to you, comments that were made to you or about you, right? These are the things that you've lived through that have then shaped what you think is okay, what you think is not okay, how you think you should act, how you think you shouldn't act, all those little things. And it's incredibly interesting, but also a little sad to consider how early they start in childhood. And so if you were fortunate to have a ton of good examples and open-minded parents, then your self-concept would likely be a bit more positive. Now, many parents have incredibly good intentions, but often with their own limiting beliefs, depending on the level of personal development that they have done, their level of open-mindedness and what they think is possible for you. Many parents have good intentions, but unknowingly pass on beliefs and ideas and perspectives that then limit your self-concept and make you think that certain things are not okay or not possible or should not be pursued. So for example, I am a mom of both a girl and a boy. I have a son and a daughter. And I remember just being completely fascinated when I first learned about this research of how many parents unintentionally treat their daughters as leaning more towards more domestic traits, while teaching their sons and passing on the values of having more, like STEM would be a good example. And parents do this often unknowingly. In my own lab, we studied stereotypes, and I would run studies asking parents directly about their attitudes, and they would say that they value math. They think math is important. And yet when you look at things like how often are they talking to their daughters about math, or sitting down to help their daughters with math homework, or encouraging them to pursue something like a computer science degree, you see that the numbers drop significantly. And I think that is just one very clear example where when you then look at it and you talk to the kids, you talk to the daughters versus you talk to the sons, you then see a very clear difference in how they feel about the subjects. So there's ample research out there to show that girls are then reporting less interest in math, less interest in STEM activities, less willingness to pursue computer science or engineering. And it feels outside their comfort zone, and it feels intimidating, and it feels like something that's just not for them, versus boys are not reporting the same things. They're not reporting that to the same degree as girls are. And so much of this is being traced to their self-concept and their definition of if they're capable in math versus if they're not. And there's so much more nuance that we can get into when it comes to things like stereotypes or academic stereotypes or capability and things like that. But self-concept in the research has been shown to be a clear driver of whether girls choose to pursue something like a math degree versus something like an arts degree. And it comes down to their understanding of themselves, what they're capable of, and what they think they should be doing. And that was molded and determined by the experiences they had, the conversations they had, and the things that they were taught, even if they were not directly taught that math is not for them, if they were taught that something else is for them instead, that becomes the thing they default towards, and unintentionally and implicitly, math becomes something that's not for them. And so this is just an example that comes to mind because this is what my research centered around. So I spent years studying this, but I think the same exact thing is happening to business owners and to leaders and to really smart, capable people who have just never been taught to sit down and really consider who it is that they are and why they think they are that way. And I know it sounds incredibly simple, and your first reaction might be, well, Christina, I know who I am. I know who I am. And that's wonderful, but I will still challenge you on it because so much of who we think we are is just the comfort that we are used to. And so in last week's episode, I challenged you to sit down and to write at least 10 to 20 adjectives of how you would define yourself. And so if you've tried that exercise, I want to know if you were able to get past 20. But if you haven't had time to do that exercise yet, this week is a great time to do it. Can you list at least 20 different adjectives to truly, truly describe yourself? And not just the positives and the, great traits and the things that you're proud of, but truly your blind spots, your weaknesses, the things that aren't so great about you, because we all have them. Because once you can start to see who you are more holistically, your strengths as well as your blind spots, then you can start to get into where that came from and why you are the way that you are. And that's my whole philosophy. When you understand how you operate, doing everything else, becoming more productive, staying more consistent, having that confidence is so much easier to have as a byproduct when you know how you operate and how to optimize that first. Okay. So your self-concept comes from firsthand experience, which is the primary lived experience that you've had. Okay. That's the first source. Now, the second source of your self-concept comes from secondhand experience. These are the experiences that you have had through association. Maybe your friends had experiences that they would talk to you about, and that planted seeds of doubt or opportunity or for me, not for me in your mind. It's just secondhand experience, hearing about it, seeing it, having those associations that you then plant for yourself around, okay, if that happened to that person, that can happen to me too. Now, the beautiful thing about secondhand experiences is that they go both ways, the positive and the negative. And this is where role models come in. If you were someone who was exposed to, let's say, your parents were entrepreneurs, they ran their own business, you are way more likely to try to pursue that for yourself. So exposure to positive role models can actually be so incredibly beneficial for us because it shows us the possibility and the opportunity and the fact that there is a path there for us as well. But the same thing goes for negative experiences. If someone else, let's say you're a business owner and your friend is a business owner and she posted a reel or some piece of content online and it went viral and she got trolled and people left hate comments, you might look at that and say like, no thanks, not for me. I am going to go stick to writing on a blog or something. Seeing the experiences of others always makes us think about that experience applied to ourselves. And it might not be consciously, it might not be directly, but it could be in the back of your mind, stopping you from trying something. So you might never consider, let's say, putting out content because you would never even get to that point. Before you even get to the process of putting out content, you might logically already talk yourself out of it. And I say logically because it feels logical to us in the moment. You might talk yourself out of it and just say, you know what? Content creation is not for me. I love writing. I'm going to stick to my blog. Blog is better, right? Here's all the reasons I can give myself why this will work better. And you'll rationalize it and talk yourself out of it before you even give that opportunity a chance. And you won't even notice that you've did that. And so there's so many missed opportunities that we have that we don't even recognize we've missed because they clash with our self-concept and don't allow us to even view them as opportunities to begin with. Okay, so we have firsthand firsthand experience, secondhand experience, and then the third source of influence is a third-hand experience, of course. And this is the sort of context that you live in, the environment that you're in, the neighborhood, the community, the society, the culture that you're part of. These are sort of the larger, overwhelming institutions, structures, belief systems in place that guide your development. And so if you grew up in one culture versus one society versus one religion, those norms and beliefs and influences come through in how they shape your self-concept as well. And so they're important to consider, because someone who grows up in, a Western metropolis is going to have a different perspective automatically through just sheer exposure to different cultural norms and understandings than someone who perhaps grew up in a small rural town with very little diversity. Right. And so when you understand the three main sources of influence that come through, us at the core have all these layers of firsthand personal experiences, secondhand experiences, and then thirdhand experiences that completely shape our makeup and development and who we are and our self-concept. And so this is what I mean when I say that who you are is like a puzzle piece with a picture on it outlined by other people. Your firsthand, secondhand, thirdhand experiences have created this outline. Your perspective of it, your interpretation of it, your willingness to push the boundaries, to challenge yourself, to stay or go, that's how you're coloring it in and the detail that you're adding to it. And so at the beginning of this episode, I talked about how so many of us are really pushing and aiming to improve our performance and going perpetually into this loop of constantly wanting to do more, trying to do it better, faster, stronger, harder, and then feeling like there's this constant pressure behind us to just keeping on. And so when you understand how your self-concept plays into this, number one, I hope you're starting to see that who you are isn't necessarily who you think you are. There are so many more blind spots that we're all not aware of because we don't take the time to actually consider the fact that they could be blind spots because we were taught not to even look at it in the first place. And so it's shaping your perspective. Your perspective is then shaping your outlook, the way that you are interpreting every single situation, whether you're viewing something as an opportunity, as a threat, or letting it pass you by, not giving it any attention whatsoever. The amount of risk that you're willing to take, how much you're willing to bet on yourself, whether that's by speaking up and sharing some insights in a meeting versus by quitting your corporate job and starting your passion-led online business, right? And everything in between. How much risk you're willing to take, how much discomfort you're willing to tolerate, what you're willing to actually do, and how far outside of your comfort zone you're willing to go before it starts to feel like way too much, not only way too hard, but way too not like you. And so when we sit back and we look at our productivity, our motivation, our consistency, our confidence, you can start to see that they are all connected at the core of who you are and how you show up and how you've been taught to be who you are, what you've been taught to question, and what you've been taught to not even look at because it's completely in your blind spots. And so when you sit down and you take the time to really analyze who you are, what your self-concept is, what feels uncomfortable to try, what feels logically like the right thing to do, the right strategy, the right skill that you just can't bring yourself to try or to stick with consistently, well, that's where switching to another strategy, hopping between skills, just flip-flopping all over the place will never work and will always bring you back to your core, because that is the ultimate driver underneath it all. Because if fundamentally I don't think that I should really be doing something, or that goal that I actually have clashes with the values that I've been taught to have, like there's so many excuses that we come up with that justify our own limitations when the limitations are our own self-concept. That is what I want you to understand, because as long as the same limitations are there, You can keep slapping on more strategies, more techniques, different coaches, other courses. None of it will stick until you shift the self-concept that's underneath. And you can't shift it until you understand exactly what it is to begin with. And so again, last week I challenged you to write down at least 20 adjectives to describe yourself. And then the second question was to see if you can actually list out all the things that you're allowed to do, because that lets you read in between the lines of what you don't feel like you have permission to do yet. And so this week, I'm going to challenge you to sit down and to think about your 3 sources of influence: your firsthand experience, your secondhand experience, and your thirdhand experience, and just brainstorm. Have a conversation with yourself, if you will. Talk it out and just see what comes up around what your life experiences have taught you, what being around other people and seeing the life experiences that they have had has taught you, and what your overall upbringing, social norms, cultural exposure, what all of that has taught you about how you should be and who you should be so far. And there is so much important information just waiting to be uncovered just in those 3 questions. Because ultimately, your performance comes down to understanding how you operate and who you are at the core so that you are optimizing the right things. If you found this interesting and you'd like to go deeper into your self-concept and who you are and understand exactly how you operate and how this is showing up for you, well, then the community I'm building is the right next step for you. It's called the Coherence Edit, and I will leave the link for it down below. It's open to the founding members now, so you can come in, check it out, and then cancel anytime, as it's on a month-by-month basis. The goal of it is to help you understand how you currently operate so that when you learn the strategies of improving your presence, your communication, your performance, all these external factors about yourself that affect how you are viewed in your career and how you show up in your business, you understand exactly what to change and why, because you first took the time to develop that self-awareness. And so the link is down below. Feel free to check it out. And I am excited to see you on the inside. If you have any questions, reach out to me and I will see you next week.